what we were tracing, when somebody's positive, we try to contact everybody that's associated with that person and warn them of their potential exposure and the quarantine stuff that goes on along with that. We were contact tracing roughly 5 to maybe 10 people a week, and Thursday alone, we had over 140 contacts associated with those additional, say, 21 cases that came in. So there obviously something's happening. And in talking to my colleagues, directors of health across the state, we see an awful transmission from travel, people coming home, bringing it into the household, and we're also seeing it associated with the sport activities. Not so much on the field, but across the state. It's the social activities that must be associated with the sporting activities that seem to be facilitating the spread. So there's an awful lot going on. We do not see spread in the schools, which is a good thing. We are finding schools to be one of the safer places, probably because they have protocols in place and they're catching the kids at the doors or before the doors so that we don't see a lot of positive cases or spread inside schools. So we're seeing schools are one of the safer places. I don't know. We don't have a lot of time. I do have another appointment at 10 o'clock. So why don't I stop and open it up for questions, because it's probably why most of everybody is here.
So Janet, while the first questions may be rolling in, let me ask a question to Mark that we get a lot that was in my remarks. Mark, can you help us understand kind of how we're able to keep the schools open even as the rates are kicking up? Last spring at 2 cases, everybody shut down, and soon thereafter the governor shut the state down. We're in a different place right now. Could you help us understand that, please?
Well, back in March, again, it was something totally new. Nobody knew how to deal with COVID-19. We didn't have a lot of treatments. We just, great unknown, and a lot of fear was going on. Of course, the media doesn't help things. They kind of rip it all up. But in the schools, based on CDC and state guidance, they put in mitigating strategies, if you will. There's a number of safeguards in place so that when you put them all together, I think we're seeing the result that we don't see it spread in school. If any one failure maybe fails, if you will, somebody forgets to put a mask on or something, we have the other mitigating factors that kind of compensate for that. So all in all, we're finding there is not a lot of school transmission. A lot, again, I mentioned it before, it's associated with travel, sporting events, and we're seeing a lot of transmission in a household. Somebody goes away for business and comes back to the house, or we're seeing a lot of cases where somebody comes back from college. You have a college-age student who's been away for the first semester. They're coming home or will be coming home shortly for the breaks, and they're bringing it into the household. And once COVID gets into the household, we're finding it very hard to stop the spread there. So there are CDC guidelines for stopping it in the household. But they're very kind of strict, and people are finding it hard to comply with, but that's what they need to do. But again, those mitigating strategies that are in effect in the school systems are being very effective at stopping person-to-person spread in the schools.
Okay, Mark, we are getting a lot of questions in. A couple of them tie back to just what you said about kids coming home from college. Can you let us know, like, basically what those protocols are? Because we obviously in Westport, we are going to have a lot of kids coming home in the next 2 weeks. What are the specific mitigating factors that people should be putting in place when their kids come home?
Well, all of these cases are dealt with on a case-by-case basis because there's so much different information, and the facts are a little bit different in every case. But let us say you have a college-age student that was tested in college just before coming home. It would almost be like the travel advisory the state has in place. If they've got a negative test, I think you can presume that they are negative, and your risk of transmission in a household is going to be on the lower side. Of course, then you have to look at how are they traveling home? Are they getting into a carload with a bunch of other kids and driving up from Florida or wherever they may have gone off to college? That's a risk factor. On their way back, traveling home, did they make various stops, hang out at a couple of clubs someplace along the way to say goodbye to their friends? All these things need to be looked at and kind of assessed in terms of what they may do to somebody's risk. But if somebody's coming home from college, they get into their own car, they drive home, they've had a negative test, the risk is on the lower side. If you've got somebody that's positive coming back from college, and unless they have the test, I think you should almost make that assumption. They should be quarantined for 14 days, just like the state's travel advisory. We would recommend anybody who's traveled out of state or been out of state more than 24 hours. The guidelines for how to deal with a positive person at home are kind of lengthy, they're kind of complex. And the best place to get those would be cdc.gov. Again, that's cdc.gov, and they have a complete listing of what to do if somebody is positive in a household. People are supposed to eat separately from the family. They're supposed to stay in their bedroom or some other room where they can be basically isolated for 14 days. They should be using their own bathroom if they have one and can use it. Or the bathroom that is shared needs to be cleaned on a very regular and deep clean kind of a basis. So there's a lot that could be done or needs to be done in a household to stop that spread. A lot to consider when a college kid comes home. Follow the guidelines for the travel advisory. Negative test is a good thing. If you don't have a test, assume they're positive.
Next, can you address the no mask lunch? A group was quarantined due to a lunch. I think that might be a Bill question or a.
Everything needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Again, a lot goes into trying to assess the risk. So I don't know enough about a particular lunch to know why a whole class is quarantined, but I would imagine several mitigating factors broke down at that point. You can eat lunch without a mask. Obviously, you have to eat lunch or dinner without a mask. You can go to a restaurant and take your mask off while sitting at a table. And we're not seeing a lot of spread in restaurants at this point either. So eating with your mask off is not necessarily, it does increase risk. There's nothing without risk. But it can be safe so long as people are 6 foot apart. They're not speaking loudly, broadcasting. So I can't comment on the situation that the person who asked the question made, because I get circumstances in terms of what increased that level of risk that the decision was made that the whole class had to be quarantined.
Nicole, do you want to speak to that? It ties to WIS, and it obviously there are multiple variables here. Let me just stress to all families, we really are trying to make the full return work well. K-5, our most challenging piece is lunch, and districts all around us have had that issue. And we're really working hard to make it safe. So Nicole, you could sort of pick up this one and then we'll move back to questions from Mark. Thanks.
Sure. In consultation with Cheryl Zolkowski and our nurse and Patty Falber, the reason we had to quarantine that group of students that were in the cafeteria at the time was because they were all unmasked eating lunch, as Mark Cooper said. And the person who received a positive test was in contact with every single student during that lunch shift. They were a staff member and they went around and talked to every single student. So out of an abundance of caution, we asked all of the students to stay home and the other staff members that staff member was in contact with. It does not have the situation we're in this week, which is a remote learning for one class, is different than the situation we were in for the last 2 weeks, which was the quarantining of all of those students. I don't know if Cheryl, you want to say anything else or if I've answered the question, Janet. I'm not sure if there was another piece of it.
Nope, that was the end of that question. What is the criteria for closing the school? What would the infection rate need to be?
Well, we look at that very carefully. If the infection rate in the community may be high, which quite honestly, it's getting high now. It's considered, as of Friday anyway, 7.9. If the community rate is high, but yet we're seeing very little transmission in the schools themselves, we'd have to have a discussion as to, since school seems to be the safer place to be, maybe we want to make sure it is open and make sure the kids can go to school and get their learning. socialization, all that stuff that schools are important for. So just because a community has a outside rate that's high, we'd have to look very carefully. The converse of that, of course, would be, and I don't see this happening because the statistics aren't showing it true. Let's say we had a higher rate in the school and a low rate in the community, we'd still have the opposite discussion of saying, well, maybe we should close the school even though the rate in the community is low. If the rate in the school is high, we might have to close it. So again, every situation has to be discussed and considered on its own merits, case-by-case basis, looking at a whole mess of facts. So a high community rate does not necessarily mean we're going to have to close the schools unless the governor's office comes out and says statewide everything's closed for whatever reason. The governor can do that, local public health officials, and I don't think the superintendent can do that all by ourselves.
Okay.
And let me add to that quickly perspective, because I'm in daily contact with my fellow superintendents, but every Friday we do an intensive roundup. This was the exact discussion. Because as actually Tony Pesco said, it may be changing, we're an island of gray and a sea of red. But we have districts in the red category for the state, north of 25, which is in the indicators as the state has given us, but they're not closing. So Norwalk, which is in the red, is staying with their exact same plan. Bridgeport, a very different community in the red, is making some modifications, but the schools are staying open. Any other districts approaching red, and all the superintendents talked, is we're keeping the schools open. And we are very careful to catch the infection, let's just call it that, isolate it, quarantine, determine how much of the district does have to go into temporary remote. So we're not even using the verb close anymore. It's going into temporary remote mode. So that's where we're very different. As of Friday, we are advised statewide it's highly unlikely that the governor is going to sweep in as he did in the spring and from on high put us all out into distance learning. Now, I've learned to never say never in this business right now under COVID-19, but we are all operating that almost no matter how high that infection gets, as long as we're not seeing spread in the schools, as long as the mitigating factors are working in the schools, that we will try and keep the in-person going as long as possible.
Okay, thank you. Next question, if a child is in close contact with someone in another town, how does this info, we're talking about not Westport, because we know you're in the same health department. How does this information get reported to the Weston schools?
For a variety of reasons. We're finding that parents are reporting to the schools faster, if you will, than the laboratory who does a test that maybe finds a positive, reports that to the state, that gets entered into the state system, that gets referred down to us. Obviously, we're looking at the state numbers and data systems every day, multiple times during the day. We're also getting phone calls from our superintendents or our school nurses saying that, hey, they just got notice of a particular potential case going on in the school or around the school. Initially, the state was saying public health really can't do much until we get a positive confirmation lab result. We're finding that that's taking too long. We start working on, if we have let's call it a presumed positive case from, if Cheryl calls the school nurse and says the mother just called and said that, Johnny is a positive test result, we're going to accept that. Mother has no reason to mislead anybody. We're going to say, let's start looking into that situation, get the names of any close contacts, start getting the notifications out there, and we'll get confirmation in a day or so, if you will, through the state information system. But it's more important to get on top of the potential cases to stop the spread in the school. And I think because we're doing it this way, that's part of the reason why schools are such a safe place to be. We are keeping COVID out of the schools, and hopefully we can keep doing that.
Okay, does a student need to test negative and show those test results before coming back to school?
Well, there's a couple of pieces of information lacking in that question. Was that student confirmed as a positive case previously, or did they have close contact with somebody who was a positive case? If they've been quarantined, meaning they've had close contact or they're positive themselves, you cannot test out of quarantine. So it is no longer recommended that a negative test be required to re-enter school. It may be good information, you may need it for other reasons, but a negative test does not get you out of quarantine.
And I'd urge all families to keep joined at their hip the COVID health and safety manual that's up on the website, and the version we updated on the 15th, because again, that's where things are changing on us a lot. But now, as we've been advised, a negative test does not get you out of quarantine, but once you're past quarantine, then you're free to come back. We cannot require the test at that point, and that's an issue for employees as well as for our students. But the quarantine length, as Mark has just said, is what is critical. And again, that's all in the documentation that all families have access to in the health and safety manual.
Let me just add something to that. And the reason for it is because you can still have a test after the 14 days. And because if they're doing the PCR test, the DNA test, there can be fragments of that DNA still in one system that the test will pick up and say that it's positive. But the fact of the matter is the person doesn't have a viral load, doesn't have symptoms, is not shedding virus any longer. They can look like they test positive, but they're really not in danger of spreading any virus.
Okay, why do you not take temperatures of kids, teachers, and staff? Wouldn't that be a good proactive step?
Well, initially we were recommending everybody take temperatures. We were doing it here in our own office. Unfortunately, there's so many different symptoms. Not everybody has a fever. So if you rely on temperature alone, you're going to miss a good part of the cases. A lot of people are asymptomatic, have no symptoms whatsoever. So unfortunately, I think people are relying on the temperature check way too much, and for not thinking about all the other symptoms that could kind of indicate COVID-19. So it's labor intensive. You got to keep a lot of records. People's temperature goes up and down for a variety of reasons, not just COVID. So it really is not an accurate indicator of whether somebody has COVID or not. It's just one more potential symptom.
Okay. If rapid spread is being caused by social events, are there some practical recommendations to stop those activities?
Yes, and we've been trying to do that and discourage people from social activities. And it's not all social activities that are, in fact, causing the spread. We're seeing a lot of spread being associated with youth sports, in particular soccer and ice hockey, for whatever the reasons. It doesn't appear to be spreading on the field, meaning that the kids' interaction while they're playing. But somehow, and I don't think we have the answer to this yet, it's somehow associated with other activities associated with those events. If we had the answers as to how it's being spread, we could probably be more effective in stopping it. But again, this is a whole new worldwide experience. We're learning as we go. We've learned a lot. We learn more every day and week. Someday, hopefully, we will know where that spread is happening in those social events. We're not seeing spread at restaurants, and that's a social activity, if you will. People getting together, they're taking their masks off, they're eating, and they're talking. Why isn't it spreading at restaurants? I really don't have the answer for that either, but it's not where we're seeing the numbers. So some activities, social activities, seem to be higher risk than others. We're trying to figure out why that is. I can only tell you what we're seeing in the numbers where our cases are coming from. They're coming from travel out of state, they're coming from college kids coming home, and it's associated with these soccer events. That tends to be where we're seeing our numbers of positivity at the moment.
Mark, speaking of travel, can you address the importance of all of us staying home during the holiday season and not doing much travel outside of the state?
Well, I don't know if there's any state that's left that's safe to travel to anymore. I think New Hampshire's like the only one in the Northeast. Massachusetts put Connecticut on the list. I'm hearing that New York just put Connecticut on their list of travel. So the unfortunate part is this, an awful lot of people are asymptomatic. You really never know who's positive or not. And the more you travel, the more greater the risk you're going to have. And if we could tell who's positive and negative. You could stay away from the positive people, or at least try to get them to stay home and not travel. But unfortunately, awful lot of people walking around, they feel great, but they carry COVID-19, and some of them are super spreaders. They go out and they visit and talk to a lot of people, and they're much more effective at spreading it than other people. And that's part of the science that is going on right now, apparently. Some people are much more effective spreading COVID-19 than other people. I might be positive and I might be going out talking to people, but for whatever the reason, unknown at this point, is I'm not spreading it. Versus other people are positive, and it seems that wherever they go, they leave a path of COVID behind them. They're looking at that. They're trying to figure out why that is. The same thing with why some certain social events are more easily spread. It's more easily spread versus others. Again, we're learning as we go.
Next question, can you comment on the false negative rate of the PCR test that is being used locally? For example, at Long Lots. If a test is negative, how confident can patients, especially symptomatic patients, be that they are actually negative?
I'll have to look into this a little bit more. In fact, I think that the site here in Westport is actually doing the antigen test. I don't believe it's the PCR test. PCR is the DNA test. That's very accurate. Very few false positives on the PCR test. On the antigen test, there is a much higher rate of false positivity. And it's because it's checking different things in your body. And that's part of what I kind of alluded to before. Some people still have bits of COVID, if you will, in their bodies. They may not be spreading it, but they could tend up to be positive. So I don't think the Westport site is PCR. I think it's the antigen. There is a higher false positivity rate with the antigen test. And if anybody asked me, I guess I would suggest going for the PCR test whenever possible. It's much more accurate. It's antigen's much more positive. I'm sorry, PCR is much more accurate. The antigen is not, and I'll have to look to see if they changed their testing up in Westport. I don't think they did.
Next question, what is the protocol for a parent who's also a teacher when their child has been required to quarantine? The tracing only required the kids to quarantine. The parent-teacher returns to school. Should this be considered a potential risk since they are living in the household?
Of course, it's a potential risk. It sounds like the child of the teacher was not a positive case. It was a contact of somebody who was. A contact of a contact is not considered a contact, which means she could go to work, or anybody could go to work. He or she could go to work. A contact, let's say, so you have a positive, I'm positive, and anybody who comes with it, associates with me is going to be considered a contact. Now, because you've had contact with me, your risk for getting COVID is much higher than somebody who has not. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, but because your risk is higher and because our efforts are really focused on trying to stop this spread, we're going to say you need to quarantine. You can't go out and socialize with a lot of people, because within that 14-day period, you could become positive. You're not necessarily going to, but you could become positive. So that's why you're quarantined for 14 days. Most people, if exposed, will get COVID symptoms, if they're going to get them at all, within 3 to 5 days. They can become positive with up to 14 days after an exposure. That's why that 14-day period of time. So it sounds like the teacher was a contact of a contact. That student in a household is not necessarily positive. If that child was to get a test and become positive, now the teacher would also have to quarantine and stay out of work. I hope the explanation not confusing.
Okay, how can winter indoor sports like wrestling and basketball be deemed safe? Mask wearing for athletes seems necessary, yet on the flip side, how will they be able to breathe during an intense sport such as basketball? Seems like super spreader potential.
Exactly, and that's why I think they're looking at whether winter sports are going to be allowed or not. When the rates were very low, I think they were considering that maybe we can get away with letting that go forward. I do believe that's under careful consideration now, whether the winter sports will be allowed to go on or not. If it was up to me, I would say they probably should not, because the risk is getting too high. It's out in the community. We're seeing COVID spread with sporting activities. And if the rates in the community are getting as high as they are, and we don't know really who is not, who is positive, and we're assuming everybody potentially is, then I think winter sports are not a good idea.
Okay, then we have, when is the best time to get tested? I've heard that the 3 to 5 day mark will yield the most accurate result. Is this true?
I think if the question is evolved around whether I've had an exposure, should I run right out and get tested? The answer is no. You should wait a little while, because even though you were exposed, let's say you was a transmission of COVID, it takes a little while for the virus to replicate in your body and get to a level where it can be detected. If you run right out the day after you had an exposure, you may have COVID in your body. Your body may effectively eliminate it. That's why we have healthy immune systems, and you never really get COVID, so you won't turn positive. Or you lose that battle and you do get COVID, and that takes a few days for your body to be able to show that positive. Janet, you're muted.
Thanks. So waiting 3 to 5 days after you've been exposed is the best time.
Yes, it's better. Yes, I would not recommend running right out after somebody says you've been a potential contact.
Okay. 2 questions again about college students coming home. I'm going to read them both to you so you can sort of answer them both. Even though with negative test results, with the challenge with college kids or students potentially exposed, is the 14-day incubation period could still result in a positive case later. How does the school deal with that? And secondly, some schools in Fairfield County are going virtual for a full week after Thanksgiving as a way to proactively address the possibility of spread stemming from families getting together for the holiday. Is that something we here in Weston should consider?
Well, hopefully everybody is aware of the potential risk around the holidays and are cutting back. I've made the decision in my household, we are not going to do the family get together. We've always had big ones. That's obviously a decision everybody personally makes themselves. Yes, there's risk. Whether the school wants to shut down for a week after Thanksgiving or not really is school policy, not something that the director of health would necessarily get involved in, unless we see huge spikes after Halloween. And this is going to be a critical week, I think, for a lot of us. Let's see what happened after Halloween. We know that young people went out and had parties. They typically do that sort of stuff. A couple of big ones have made the national news, the media, in terms of big crowds of the younger crowd getting together and having fun. Kind of can't blame them, but it's not a smart thing to do. And if we find rates spiking after Halloween, I think we're going to see, that's just more evidence that we're going to see it after Thanksgiving as well. We're going to have to make that, I think the school's going to have to make that evaluation and decision as we get closer to Thanksgiving. What are the rates? Is the trend going up much, much higher than it is today, or has it started to come back down? I think what happens in the community and school depends an awful lot with how the public responds to the recommendations to reduce socialization and try to stay away from people, wear masks, all those things that people are trying to tell you to do or not do.
Yeah, Janet, let me speak to that quickly. And I'm in literally almost every day I'm in touch with superintendents. It's just not accurate that other districts are doing preemptive closing right now. That's not occurring. We talked intensively about that as superintendents Friday, talked a bit with Mark about it. The mode right now is, it's really 4 data points we look at. What is any spread happening within the district and within the town? We look at that very closely. We then look at if we have spread, why is it happening? Then we look at how we doing with our mitigating strategies, which one of that is when we know we have a known positive case, how good are we at isolating that and quarantining around that and doing some amount of temporary remote mode. It might be a classroom or two, it may be an entire building, entire district. But no superintendent right now in the
Very
region.
nice. All right. So you let me know when, all right?
I think we need to all mute.
Okay, super.
It's looking at a preemptive temporary remote mode. But then that larger data in the region we are looking at, that's that fourth point. And if the larger data in the region suggests that going into a preemptive temporary remote mode would be good, we may go there. But again, none of us are there. Let me give that example. We have communities in the red that are continuing on with their schooling scenarios. We have 3 international nations, England, Germany, and France, that have shut down and they're still keeping their schools going. So that's how we're trying to deal with this. A preemptive move to temporary remote, none of us feel we should go there yet, but we're watching it really, really closely. I can assure you of that.
Okay, thank you. This could be a question for Bill, you again. Why don't they install plexiglass at lunch desks in the middle school like they have at WIS?
Drew, do you want to speak to that? Maybe Julie can speak to that. I mean, the whole provision of lunch is a big challenge. It's different for our 6th through 12th graders than for our K through 5ers. But Drew, do you want to speak to that a bit, please?
Sure. Well, at the middle school, we do hold lunch in a cafeteria for the larger team in each grade and the library for the small team. And we were able to space out student desks and a couple tables in the library 6 feet apart, which has been beneficial. And it is 1 child per table in the library, plus the additional desks. Halfway through lunch, 15 minutes in or so, I do start to dismiss for recess. And I don't really call it recess this year. It's kind of just time outside to walk around. And the students do keep their masks on out there. I do have a mask break area. But, you know, my understanding was with the 6 feet and the limited time in there, all the students are facing one way. You know, the desk shields only do so much. So we did not go, you know, ahead with this. And based on the spacing really between the students and the 2 locations.
Okay, thank you. This is for Mark, when a person tests positive, how many days prior to the positive test does the contact tracing cover?
So somebody tests positive, it would be 48 hours prior to. Now, you don't have to necessarily test positive if you have COVID symptoms. You'd also say the start of symptoms would be, you'd also look back 48 hours. So either the start of symptoms or a positive test, we're going to go back 48 hours and try to identify anybody who had a direct contact with a person who is, at this point, either confirmed positive by testing or presumed because of symptoms.
Okay, trying to get Mark's questions in here. Question about testing a child that has been exposed. My son was quarantined for 14 days. We had him tested 4 days after exposure. When we got the negative test, we allowed my other child to go back to school. Is it safe to say that is okay?
Sounds like it. It sounds like the first child was a direct contact of somebody that was identified as being a positive. And the second son or daughter, I forget the gender there, but the second child would be considered a contact of the first one. So it's contact of contact. Contact of contact is not considered, doesn't have to quarantine. So again, I don't have all the facts here, but it sounds like, yes, it was appropriate.
Okay. Next, with a group that has quarantines, such as the lunch group mentioned, COVID spread throughout that group, meaning has COVID spread throughout the group exposed?
I wouldn't know that sitting here. I'd have to know a lot of names and stuff, and clearly under HIPAA, we can't talk about that stuff. So the answer is I don't know.
Cheryl, I think either Cheryl may just be able to speak to that generically without mentioning names.
Basically, to my knowledge, at least in the school setting, there has been no spread. If something has happened on the outside, we necessarily wouldn't be made aware of that. The health district would take over there. But as far as the school setting goes, we have not had, student to student spread going on.
Let me add a little. At the Friday roundtable, all superintendents shared. It's not scientific, but only one district out of the 15 districts at the roundtable had any evidence of any within school student-to-student spread. Now, over the weekend, I know that changed because I know one district very, very well where there may well be student-to-student spread. But here we are, November 2nd, and that's a lot of districts, that's a lot of students, that's a lot of staff and students on quarantine, up in the several hundreds easily across all of those districts. And for the superintendents to be saying within district, up until this weekend, no evidence of student-to-student spread, that shows how schools staying in an in-person mode are a wise move at this point. We all know, however, what goes on with those same students away from us is a very different issue.
Okay. I'm looking for, okay. If we are all trying to do our part by keeping our kids home when they are even slightly sick, why can't they Zoom into class for the day or two they need to stay home? Wouldn't it encourage parents to keep their kids home when ill and keep everyone else safe without missing school?
Yeah, I think I saw that here. I'll jump into that fast. We had put in a 5-day transition point. That was in coordination with the teachers and with the administrators, because managing students coming in one day via Zoom, one day not, is a great challenge for the teachers. And now the assistant principals don't even know what I'm about to say because things move so fast. In the task force meeting last week, Thursday, as you know, we have a task force. This was brought up, and even the teacher members of the task force said we should revisit that. We may be able to narrow that window down to a couple days to allow for it. But instantaneous, one day in, one day out, the teachers cannot manage the room. The voluntary distance learning students who depend on that as their sole instructional path, it affects their ability to be part via the Zoom, but we are going to go back and look at bringing that 5-day window down to as close to a day as possible. In a normal year, students are missing class 1 or 2 days if they're ill, and they find a way to catch up. So that would be the mode, but I can assure you from teachers and administrators at the building level, a instantaneous shift back and forth is quite problematic to manage. We also know in other districts, they're keeping at least a 1 or 2 day break on it, because I don't think Weston is gaming the system, but we know not far from us, we have families who are disappearing on and then using that remote mode for the education. But we want to have a 1 or 2 day break on it because simply, again, the teachers can't manage it if one day it's one, the next day it's next. But we're looking to shrink that 5 days down. That's coming out of last week. I'm going to talk with the assistant principals about it. The teachers on the task force said it could work. So we're going to look at that again. We'll have an announcement out on that quite soon.
Okay, Mark, can you mention again activities that are identified as low risk spread? Is there a list or statistics available regarding safer activities? It would be helpful to know updated info that demonstrates activities and their related spread.
No list per se. It's really what we're finding out during our contact tracing, and every community can be a little bit different. Though there seems to be similarities when I talk to my colleagues, directors of health across the state, we're blogging back and forth, pretty much all day long. I do see in the chat the questions like, bars are closed, restaurants are open. You can go out and eat, if you will, in groups. I think it's still up to 25 at this point. But bars are not supposed to be allowing people just to come to a bar and order a couple of drinks. It's supposed to be eating, if you will. And I know there's violations going on with that too. But you know, you think about a bar situation, people are hanging out in closer proximity, their masks are off, and they're talking back and forth. It's an aerosol spread. You know, it's coming out with your breath. And there's been a lot of discussion, you know, aerosol versus droplet. And I guess droplet is probably the more common way that it's spread. Droplet meaning larger particles that travel no more or less than 6 feet. That's why the 6 foot differential. Aerosol spread, much finer particles, can spread farther, gets up in the atmosphere. That does happen, apparently. Studies do show that it does go on, but it's not as common as the droplet spread. But either way, the mask is very helpful in reducing either one. Unfortunately, there is no risk. All I can tell you is because we're really looking at the other side of that question, where are people getting sick? And that's really what the focus is to stop it. Again, it's we're seeing travel and college and youth sports tends to be the hot markers right now that are causing the spread that we're seeing here more locally. And I work with Westport-Weston, and we're also now doing, we're working in Easton. So I'm working with the Easton School District as well. So that's the database, if you will, that I draw from. So I wish I could tell you precisely what youth activities are causing, associated with the apparently increase in spread. Because if we knew that, we would kind of stop, we'd very surgically go in there and try to stop those activities. Right now, we're still learning. So unfortunately, no list. Everybody should be assumed to be positive, and everybody should be taking those universal precautions for the foreseeable future.
Okay, have we had any positive cases from persons contact traced who were required to quarantine?
I have to say yes to that. Let's see. So if we had a positive case and we did contact tracing, the question is, have we found a positive case associated with that? You know, I don't have any specific example. Not in schools. I see Cheryl shaking her head. Not in schools, but out in the broader community, I'd have to say, if we haven't yet, we're going to soon. Last week alone, in one day, we had an additional like 140 contacts with the positive cases we were seeing last week. Out of those 140, there's going to be somebody who was a contact with somebody who's a positive case that's going to develop it. That's how spread happens.
Yeah, again, we won't be able to hold that line, but it's what I said was shared across all of the districts in the region. None of us, except in 1 or 2 cases out of several hundred, and it's probably above over 500-600 now, numbers of quarantined in the Southern Fairfield County area within school, only 1 or 2, and that was this weekend. We know that's going to change, but just that ratio tells you how well we're doing in school to keep it safe. The issues are out and about decisions that are made by students and, dare I say, families away from us.
Yeah, let me add just another thought to that. You know, yes, absolutely. You know, schools are the safest place for kids to be. We are, in fact, seeing some of the positive contacts turning, again, associated with the youth sports stuff. We're having teams, numbers of students and people on teams that are becoming positive, not just locally at the youth sports, but even the national leagues. The footballs, and they're finding that one of the players is positive, then they test other players and they're becoming positive. So I think we're seeing it, again, as Bill's stressing and I'm stressing, outside the school district. But so far in schools, again, with all the mitigating strategies that are enforced all day long, it's one of the safest places to be.
Okay, if a family does decide to travel safely during the holidays, what is the recommendation for returning to school? Can they be allowed to do a virtual distance learning during a 2-week period on their return?
I think that's a school question. If they've done safe travel, been nowhere where the mandatory travel ban or 14-day quarantine, or I guess now the state is saying that you can test out of the travel. If you go get a PCR test and it's negative after travel, you can return to work, do all those things. So after travel, let's say you've traveled safely, you get a negative test, you can go back to school, work, wherever it is you need to do.
They're actually saying if you choose to test, it has to be the PCR test, and you can test 3 days prior to leaving whatever state you're in, so that by the time you return home, you potentially could have tested negative. If you wait till you get home, you have 3 days to test here, but then of course you're probably still going to be home for 4 or 5 days until you get those results.
Cheryl, I think a point to also stress with it, it has to be the PCR test, not the antigen test. The PCR is a little bit more difficult to get a hold of, if you will, and it takes a little bit longer to get the results.
Okay, if contact tracing is in progress for a school building that my child attends, what is the directive to parents regarding outside activities like club sports? Is there an expectation that those children do not attend sporting events and practices until contact tracing is concluded?
If somebody has been identified as a close contact of a positive case, then they should be quarantining, meaning they can't go to school. If they have an outside job, they shouldn't go to a job, and they shouldn't be doing any social or sporting activities for 14 days, period.
I think what they're asking is if we, like, for example, we get a notice saying there's been a positive case identified at a school. And it may take 24 hours before they say we've concluded, all families have been contacted. I think what the person's asking is if I know, say I'm at the high school and I get that note, but I don't know yet that I've been contact traced, is my child now, am I to assume everyone at the high school doesn't go anywhere now until that contact tracing is concluded?
That's not really the way it works, and probably not enforceable. Until you're identified as a potential contact, and if you use the word contacted by a contact tracer officially, you're really free to do whatever it is that you normally do. However, let me kind of taper that with, we're finding that these in-school, the mothers and fathers have a much more communication amongst themselves. So, if you happen to get word through the internal or external communication systems that exist in the school that, your son or daughter's best friend has just been identified as a positive case or in a group of contacts, use some common sense and say, geez, no, we know that person, my child has hung out with that person. We should probably cut back on things for a little while until either we're told we're not part of that group or we're told that we are. So again, the information system that the school gets through mothers and fathers is faster than the information train that we're getting through the state official testing results system. So if you're hearing that your son or daughter has been in close contact with somebody that's being looked at as a close contact or a positive case, the smart thing to do would be cut back on activities until you know for sure.
Janet, when Mark steps off, we can speak to communication a little bit. I don't want to get in Mark's way now. If there are any last questions for him.
Yeah, there's one last question. Can Mark clarify if a college student returns home with a negative test, does that mean they do not have to quarantine for 14 days?
Based on the travel ban, that's true. I would ask some questions though. How did they get home? Did they get in a carload? Did they come from University of Florida someplace and get in a carload of 5 kids and make a drive for 3 or 4 days and stop off and eat and have some social activities after they had that test? If you take a test and it's negative and then you go do silly things, you could certainly become positive on your way home. So I would say it really depends on the total picture of what's going on. A negative test isn't necessarily a get out of jail free card. if you're going past the board, again, if you don't do safe things all the way home, you should still be considered a potential risk.
So basically, for students coming home, is the best reference the Connecticut, the ct.gov travel, sort of the travel website, follow the protocol on that section? That's what parents should do with their college kids returning home.
And yep, that holds for anybody that's traveling out of state into the state. If you've been out of the state for more than 24 hours, that is the protocol you're supposed to be following.
And that's on ct.gov. It's a travel piece of that website.
Correct. The ct.gov, make the little buttons, if you will, for all kinds of topics. Travel advisory would be one of them, yes.
Okay. That was the last question that we had for you, Mark. I think the rest are good to fill. Thank you so much for coming and taking the time to talk to us.
I hope this was helpful. Certainly, the more information we can help share, and emphasize that really we all have the responsibility to try to control and reduce spread. And it's up to us, whether the state of Connecticut or the town of Westport or Weston or Easton remains open or starts to consider going back. And I think Bill said it, we're surrounded by towns that are all red. They have not been following protocols to a certain extent, and that's what's going to happen. We're trying to keep things open, keep schools open. We want to keep restaurants open. And it's up to all of us to follow the protocols and be safe and keep everybody else safe for us if we're going to be able to do that. So thank you, PTO, for the opportunity to be here this morning and answer the questions.
Thanks, Mark. And the rest of the Weston COVID task force that Bill introduced earlier will stay on, so we can finish up asking the last couple questions. First, let me just go back. I want to make sure I cover everybody's. One is, why are there no mask requirements at Hurlbut during recess?
I don't know if Kim's on the line, but I think Kim and or Nicole could speak to that. I'm not sure if Kim's on the line.
No.
Bill, I'm here. Nicole, I can't speak to what they're doing at Hurlbut in detail. At WIS, we're toggling between calling it recess and mass break, because really we are not allowing it to look like recess, as Drew had said before in the middle school. We're very spaced apart. There is no sharing of any equipment. There is no playing tag or any of the other typical grade 3, 4, 5 games that they would have played last year. So we are sort of calling it a mass break, although it happens at the same time that recess would have happened in the past. And when they are outside, each class is by itself. So we're still cohorting by classroom, and they each have their own area to run around and get some fresh air. I had some girls the other day that wanted to read together. So I said, your choice is to be very far apart and read without your mask on, or to forego your mask break and be a little closer together. Obviously staying within that 3 to 4 feet, but they chose to have their masks on. So we are, sort of making accommodations for what students want to do during that free time, but, requiring them to be using mitigating strategies, and offering them that mask break, hopefully outside as many days as we possibly can.
And for the Hurlbut parents on the line, I can assure you it's very similar to what Nicole's explaining. You benefit from a principal and assistant principal who are incredibly detail-oriented for the safety of your children. So I think if Kim were on, the answer would be similar. It's a balancing act between a mask break and a variation on what we knew to be recess. Janet, if I might, there's a strong sense of questions here around lunch and how I provide lunch. I think I might ask the assistant principals to speak to that a little more. I think Nicole, you've done that a bit. Julie and the high school aren't quite there yet. So I think it'd be sort of helping families understand how we're managing mask breaks and then lunch. Because final comment, and I'll get out of the way. We all are learning that if we keep the masks on, we solve so many problems and avoid so many problems. Please hear the passion about masks. And so maybe if the assistant principals could speak to how mask breaks, lunch, we're addressing it to help assure the families that we're really serious about this.
Sure, I can just continue on if you want, Bill. At WIS, we do have many students eating in the cafeteria at a time. We do have screens up between them. So there's 2 students per table and there is a screen in between those 2 students. So they have their masks off, but there is a screen in between them and they are 5-ish feet apart. We have round tables, so sometimes kids are scooting their chairs a little bit and we catch them and we ask them to go back, but they're students and they're wanting to be social, right? They're social beings as children. So there's multiple adults walking in and around the cafeteria at a time. The students do not get out of their seats. The lunches are delivered to them, or they get them as they walk into the cafeteria. So it's a pick up their bag and go to their seats. If they need to go to the bathroom, they put their mask on and then they exit the cafeteria for the bathroom use. And they don't even get up out of their seats to get garbage. The garbages are wheeled around throughout the lunchtime to the different tables so the students do not have to get up. So we're trying to keep them seated with their masks off while they're eating and keep them behind those screens, and allow for some socialization. It is a social time and we do want to make sure we're taking care of them as children who are growing up socially and emotionally as well. And then from there is when they go to the mask breaks that I've described already. Our indoor mask breaks, we did have to take some last week because of the rain and snow on Friday, but we did have the students are 6 feet apart in the hallway. They are taking their masks off and they're doing a lot of creative things. So they're bringing down their sketch pad from their art teacher and some markers, or they're bringing down pencils and erasers in their sketch pad, or they're bringing down their books that they want to read. Some of them are making little paper balls and flicking them up against the wall just to play a little game to keep them a little occupied, but they are 6 feet from each other the whole time. And then there is adult monitoring up and down the hallway to make sure that they are continuing to follow all of our mitigating strategies. Again, if they have to get up and walk through the hallway, or any other student that is walking through the hallways at that time are requiring to wear masks. So anytime there is movement between the students, they are wearing masks.
Going to add a little bit for the middle school. With our full day hybrid schedule that we transitioned to last week, I did build into the period schedule. Period 3, which is in the morning, is 6 minutes longer than the other periods, as well as period 7 in the afternoon. So we have 2 class periods that are extended for mask breaks, and I've assigned the teachers either the first 5 minutes or the final 5 minutes of those 2 periods. And there's various locations outside, even a few with overhangs. So that's been helpful, as of last week when we started our full day. And really in the cafeteria, students have to have permission to stand up for any reason. That way I can assure that they have their masks on while they're throwing out their trash. The custodians are wiping down and disinfecting every student desk and table where they're eating. In the past, the students would do this, 1 or 2 students per table. The cafeteria, which holds up to 12 students, but outside, we are asking them to keep their masks on during that time outside. It's about the last 10 minutes of lunch, unless if they want to take a mask break where they have to stand along the building and spread out. We are asking them about 12 feet apart. But they are social. It is great to see them reconnecting with their friends and others in their grades. What happens is if I recognize that a group are getting a little bit too close, and even with the masks on, I do walk over and just remind them to give themselves some space when they're socializing. But I've been very pleased with their behavior outside so far.
And I can just add, I think most of you are aware that the high school is still in an early dismissal model, but we are on track to move into a full day hybrid coming up in 2 weeks on November 16th. So we are looking at a lot of ways to make sure that students are safe while they're eating lunch that are very similar to what Nicole and Drew have already described. In terms of our cafeteria setup, we will be using student desks to promote social distancing when students do have their masks off, and similarly, students will have to be seated during the time when their mask is off while they're eating. In terms of our mask break areas, They are largely outdoors, and that is on recommendation from the state. We have, as you may be aware, we have several large and small courtyards at the high school, interior courtyards, and they are set up for mask breaks outside. But of course, weather is always an issue and is increasingly a concern. So we do also have mask break areas indoors, and those are set up in large spaces. So there is a lobby area where there is a mask break area, and the desks there are set up more than 6 feet apart, as well as our Galleria hallway. If you're familiar with the building, the athletics area will also be set up that way for mask breaks for students to take indoors. So I guess we are operating on a similar plan to what the other schools are doing in terms of planning for lunch and mask breaks when we move to our full day hybrid. The only thing that I would add is I know that everyone on this team is extremely committed to the health and safety of our students and our staff. So we are really making sure that everyone is clear on what the expectations are, and we're constantly reviewing what we're doing, reflecting, making sure that what we're doing is working and is keeping people safe. And I think so far, so good, and we hope to continue that way.
Okay, we had a couple more questions come in. What recent feedback, this probably maybe Julianne or Bill, you can answer. What recent feedback have you received from high school students about the change in the schedule?
They're not super happy about it. Actually, it's interesting because I know that Lisa Wolak is meeting within the next hour with representatives from our student government to talk about that very thing. Students of their own accord have administered a survey and collected information about how students are feeling in terms of moving to a full day hybrid. And we have, as an administrative team, reviewed those results thoroughly. And Lisa is going to be speaking with the student representatives today. I can tell you that there is quite a bit of concern about lunch in terms of students wanting to see that time for socializing. And while we do recognize that that is important to students and we want to give them the freedom to socialize, we also need to make sure that they're doing that in a safe way. So we will be talking with those students about to get that messaging out that you do have the freedom to choose where you would like to eat lunch, but there are some parameters around that. I can also say that students are largely talking about missing that morning off. We don't like to call it a morning off because we do think that students are using that time to do homework, to check in with teachers, to meet with each other, to prepare for their day. I think there's a lot that's happening during that time, but students see a benefit to the flexibility of having that time and being able to use it in different ways. So, you know, we will be speaking with them about that, and you can look forward to communications, more communications coming out to the community this week about the specific plans for our full day hybrid model.
Okay, thank you. Based on what Mark said about winter sports, what is Weston High School's protocol for proceeding with winter sports? How will that decision be made? Will it be a sport by sport decision?
I'll speak to that. I mean, we're going to handle it the way we did in the fall. Simply put, most decisions superintendents make these days, you have, if you're lucky, half happy, half unhappy. And sports is a giant area of challenge. Every Friday, the superintendents, we keep going back to athletics to discuss it. We will line up with the DPH. We lined up with the DPH in the fall. We'll line up with the DPH again in the winter. As Mark Cooper told you, some of the sports in question, and let me take a quick step back. The personal becomes the professional these days. My oldest son is a college soccer coach in Pittsburgh. My next oldest son, we think went to college for learning, but his love is soccer. They're both struggling with this deeply. So I have a deep personal sense of this. Plus, I used to coach a lot of soccer with a national license. So I understand athletics. I understand the feel here. It's a big conundrum for us, but we line up with the DPH. If the DPH says a particular sport needs to sit down, that sport sits down. If the DPH takes a different stance, we're lining up with that. That's what all the districts across Connecticut are doing. We don't want to disadvantage Weston students to have a different set of decision rules, but it's the DPH. We then are working very closely with the CIAC, which is the governing body for athletics in Connecticut. We're working very actively with them to pay attention to the DPH. Yes, in a public meeting, I'm saying that. We're saying CIAC, please pay attention to the DPH. Please line up with the DPH, because that's where we need to be. You heard Mark Cooper's bias. You've heard a bit of my bias here, that we want to keep it going, but only in safe ways. There will be certain sports we think that the DPH will advise for the winter to the CIAC that should not proceed or should proceed in very different ways. That could be wrestling. It could be basketball. I'm a former basketball high school coach as well. It could be those two. But we are going to have to line up with the DPH. To do anything differently would put our Weston students at a disadvantage in terms of their opportunities from other districts. Co-curriculars matter to us a lot. I am pleased that we have continued to provide other co-curriculars here. So the minute we talk athletics, I want us to be talking arts, music, and other things. And I think we've done actually a better job than other districts out of the blocks of making sure we still have instrumental music, band music with certain limitations. We are working hard to do that. So all of those co-curriculars we still want to provide, but we're watching it very carefully, tied to the DPH. I hope that answer is helpful. I know some would say, please, Bill, just shut down athletics. We can't shut down the town athletics. We can't shut down AYU. We can't shut down the soccer clubs. We then monitor very closely and carefully how we are providing athletics, same as we would with band, theater, and all the rest.
Bill, if I can just interject real quick, it's Mark Berkowitz. I was here earlier listening to Mark Cooper. I heard what he said. I want to stress that he talked about winter sports in a general. I've received many emails since he made that statement already. He made a general statement about winter sports, but we're looking at every sport specifically and individually. So some winter sports like skiing or possibly boys swim may be able to go forward, even if wrestling and basketball, which are two that were mentioned specifically here, are not. So we are going to look at every sport individually. We're going to look at ways to mitigate the risk in each sport and see if that mitigation meshes with what we're trying to accomplish and what the DPH is asking us to do. So the state medical advisors, the state DPH, the CIAC, and our local DPH are all involved in the conversation. And we're hopeful that within the next week or week and a half, we will have some real direction from those powers so we know what we're scheduled to do.
I don't have any more questions right now for the health department, piece of this, sort of if that's our focus on this. I know we've had some questions come in about the new high school schedule change. So Lisa Wolak, the principal, will be holding our normal monthly Q&A call on Wednesday from 9 to 10. I know that email went out this morning. Those will be better sort of addressed on that call. So I don't want to take up the whole group's time with that today. But if anyone has, before we sign off, Bill, if you have any comments, anyone else, we've got about 10 more minutes scheduled.
Yeah, Janet, we don't need to run it for the full 90, but let me speak to communications a little bit because I think and the assistant principals can join in on this if need be. But we have a system now that we're using, and we keep going back and reflecting. Julie was excellent at saying almost every day we reflect on what can we do better. But every week I have a standing Zoom meeting with the assistant principals here and with Cheryl, and we're constantly reviewing things. So for example, earlier, based on the task force, they say, can you review how soon students can Zoom in if they're out? We're going to review that. And we're going to shrink that down a bit because we hear what the families are saying, but we got to balance things between what the teachers are asking for to manage class as well. But we'll be out with an announcement. But right now, stay with that 5-day until you hear from us. We'll be back promptly. In terms of communications, when we have a positive case, what we do is the following. We have a text system. As soon as we learn about a positive case, Cheryl is texting the assistant principals you see here, Joe Maselli, who's head of EOC for the town of Weston. He's in that loop. Mark Cooper's in that loop. Dr. Laura Marks is in that loop. So literally within 5 or 6 minutes, all those key leaders know that we've got a confirmed positive case. Then we quickly assess what needs to be the district-wide communication. We've gone back and forth on, is a district-wide communication necessary? We have firmly come back to say, yes, it is necessary. And we now will actually add in something. For a student, if it's a confirmed positive case for a student, we will add in the grade. That's new. We will add in that grade information. So let's, we'll say a student in Hurlbut, 1st grade, or we'll say a high schooler, 9th grade. But as you know, there's a lot of very strict, and they got to be strict, federal protections in the health and medical areas to privacy. Other districts have at least provided that grade. We will do the same for that concern about the contact tracing, so that families can go, okay, I think I better still worry, but you've helped me focus a bit. We can't go into any more detail than that because it'll give away privacy. We will not tell you the staff level in the building, because let's say you have 7 or 8 kindergarten teachers, if that already has narrowed it way too much for the law to allow us. But you will still get a district-wide notice, confirmed positive case. And then, it's now about 24 hours max. Within 24 hours, then you get a specific follow-up from that school, if it's school specific, which it tends to be, saying, we have now completed the contact tracing. If you've not heard from us, rest assured that from everything we know, you're fine. And in that would be also a statement about what's happening in terms of any adjustments for schooling. Now, for that first district-wide, there may be a case where, as we had, where we say we have a confirmed positive case and X building is going into temporary remote mode for at least the next day. That's to allow us to do the contact tracing and communicate. We've now learned we can get that done in about a day. And when we first had our first 2 cases, remember, it was the high school and Hurlbut that we put into temporary remote mode just for that day while we went through that contact tracing. But we've decided to stay with that first notice. Some families and staff said, don't tell us anything till you finish the contact tracing. Good question. We actually reviewed it, but we said we can't do that. One is, in a town like Weston, if we've got a positive case, the town's going to know very fast. And I believe in transparency here up to the line of protecting privacy. So we want to be transparent and say, yes, we have a confirmed positive case, stay tuned. The other reason to do that is, remember the temporary remote mode. If I have to put a school, and I'm the one who does it, if I have to put a school into temporary remote mode and I'll tell you why, you're going to be wondering. So temporary remote mode, positive case. The other reason we think it's important to give that general is that when you get that contact tracing call, if you get one, we don't want it to be a surprise to you. We want you to have some at least sense that you might get a call. So again, we've thought this through. Nothing's perfect, but simply put, general letter comes out to everybody. Then a school specific letter comes out, and I left out, then that school specific letter is forwarded on by me to the entire district, because we want you all to have the loop closed on this particular or several particular cases. So again, we keep reviewing it, we keep looking at it, but it's rooted in transparency. Other communication piece is, we've got a dashboard that lists specifically the number of students with, I'm looking at right now, number of students with positive confirmed cases, number of staff with positive confirmed cases, number of students currently in quarantine, number of staff currently in quarantine. Some parents said, hey, could you do that daily? So Cheryl, thank you for updating that information daily and indicating when it's updated. So literally now it's updated as of November 2nd. So you clearly have, as a district, a community, a clear handle on where we are. So comments on communication, would love to hear it, but please hear, sorry to keep saying here, please hear that we're reviewing and we feel best right now about where we are.
Anyone else have any last comments before we wrap up? Thank you all so much for taking the time. Clearly this is, there's lots going on in the community, so I'm sure we'll hear, you know, I think the more, as we've all always said from the PTO standpoint, the more communication, the better. So, you know, anyone has questions, reach out to your principals, reach out to Dr. McCursey, reach out to the PTO. We'll track it down for you. And, you know, we just want to keep everybody informed and safe and healthy.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks for your leadership. Thanks to all the PTO presidents for your leadership.
Okay, well, I just see a note here. Where do we find the updated information from Cheryl that Dr. McCursey just mentioned?
It's actually on the home webpage, the Weston Public School District homepage. And under COVID-19 resources, there's a click on that and it'll show the dashboard.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Keep in touch as you know, we all hear everything. Just keep in touch. Thank you. Bye.